My husband planned our dream vacation in Mandarin calls, not knowing my parents were from Beijing. I was folding laundry in our bedroom when I heard Derek on the phone in his office down the hall, speaking rapid Mandarin to someone he called Lily. My hands stopped moving on the towel I was holding because my husband didn't speak Mandarin. At least that's what he'd told me for the 8 years we'd been married. I'd grown up speaking it with my parents, who immigrated from Beijing before I was born, but Derek always claimed he only knew basic phrases from business trips to Shanghai. I moved closer to his office door and listened to him discussing flight arrangements and hotel reservations in flawless Mandarin. Better than mine, actually. With tones so precise he must have studied for years. He was laughing about something with this Lily person. Their conversation easy and familiar in a way that made my stomach drop. I pulled out my phone and started recording. My journalism training kicking in automatically even though my hands were shaking. Derek said in Mandarin that he'd tell me the conference got moved to Seattle, that I'd never question a work trip because I trusted him completely. Lily laughed and responded that 8 years was impressive, that most men couldn't maintain a cover story that long. He told her the flight to Bali left on Friday, and he'd already transferred another $20,000 to her account for expenses. My brain struggled to process what I was hearing because this wasn't just an affair. This was a completely separate life he'd constructed using a language he knew I spoke, but had somehow convinced himself I couldn't understand well enough to catch him. I saved the recording to 3 different cloud accounts before I even stopped shaking. The bedroom suddenly felt smaller, like the walls had moved closer while I was standing there trying to figure out how many conversations I'd missed over the years, how many phone calls in restaurants or quick exchanges at parties where he spoke Mandarin thinking I wouldn't fully comprehend. I went downstairs and made coffee with mechanical precision, my hands going through motions while my mind raced through 8 years of marriage looking for other signs I'd missed. Derek came down 20 minutes later smiling and kissed my cheek before grabbing his travel mug. He mentioned casually that his conference in Seattle got moved up to this Friday, and he'd be gone for a week, maybe longer if the meetings ran over. I asked which hotel he'd be staying at, and he said the Fairmont without hesitation, the lie smooth and practiced. I nodded and told him I'd miss him, watching his face for any sign of guilt or nervousness. Nothing registered except mild affection and the slight distraction of someone already mentally planning their trip. He left for work, and I sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone. The recording app still open, showing that 11-minute conversation that had just demolished my understanding of my own marriage. My parents lived 40 minutes away in the same house where I grew up, the walls covered with calligraphy my father practiced, and photographs from their life in Beijing before they came to America. I drove there without calling first, because I needed to see their faces when I played them the recording. My mother opened the door and immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong, pulling me inside while calling for my father. We sat in their living room and I played the recording on speaker, watching their expressions shift from confusion to shock to the particular kind of rage that comes from watching your child's heart break in real time. My father asked to hear it again, his finger following along like he was reading invisible subtitles in the air. When it finished the second time, he looked at me and said in Mandarin that Derek's accent was Northern Chinese, probably Beijing or Tianjin, that he'd been trained by native speakers for years to sound that authentic. My mother pulled out her laptop and started searching for the name Lily combined with Derek's company, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the determined energy of someone who'd worked as a research librarian for 30 years. She found a LinkedIn profile for Lily Zhao, who worked in Derek's company's Hong Kong office, her photo showing a woman in her early 30s with the kind of polished beauty that came from expensive maintenance. The profile said she'd transferred to the Seattle office 6 months ago, which aligned perfectly with when Derek started taking more frequent business trips. My father was already on the phone with his brother in Beijing, speaking quickly about needing information on someone, giving him Lily's full name and asking him to check marriage records and property registrations. His brother owned a private investigation firm and had connections throughout government offices that could access databases American investigators couldn't touch. Within an hour, my uncle called back with information that made the situation exponentially worse than a simple affair. Lily Zhao had purchased a condo in Bali 3 years ago under a company name that listed Derek as a partial owner. My uncle sent photographs of property records showing Derek's signature on documents, his passport number listed as a co-investor in a resort development company that owned 6 properties across Indonesia. The company's registration showed it had been operating for 5 years, which meant Derek had been planning this long before we'd even bought our house in Portland. My mother pulled up the company's website, and we found photos of the Bali property, a stunning villa overlooking the ocean with floor-to-ceiling windows and an infinity pool. The booking calendar showed it was blocked off for private use starting this Friday for 3 weeks. My father noted that 3 weeks was a long time for a vacation, that it sounded more like someone planning to stay permanently or at least establish residency for visa purposes. I asked what they thought I should do, and my mother said in Mandarin that we needed to document everything before Derek realized I knew, that men like him always had escape plans and we needed to move faster. I hired Catherine Brennan that afternoon based on my mother's recommendation from her library colleague, whose daughter had used her for a complicated divorce. Catherine's office was downtown in a building with security and privacy, her reception area designed to make people feel safe sharing their worst moments. She listened to the recording twice without interrupting, taking notes in some kind of shorthand that covered 3 pages of her legal pad. When I finished explaining everything my uncle had found, Catherine leaned back and said this was financial fraud in addition to adultery, that Derek had hidden marital assets in foreign accounts and property that I had legal claim to as his spouse. She explained that Oregon was an equitable distribution state, which meant everything acquired during marriage got divided fairly, but fair didn't always mean equal, and judges considered fault when dividing assets. She asked if I wanted to pursue criminal charges for fraud, and I told her I wanted him to lose everything he'd built with my trust as his foundation. Catherine smiled and said we could do that, but we needed to move carefully because Derek clearly had experience hiding money and would disappear if he suspected I was onto him. My parents invited me to stay with them for the rest of the week, their guest room still decorated with posters from my high school years. My father sat with me that evening and told me stories about Beijing in the 80s, about how trust was everything in their community because they had so little else, and how my mother had almost called off their wedding when she discovered he'd lied about a small debt. He said she'd told him that marriage required complete honesty, or it wasn't really a partnership, just 2 people using each other for convenience. His point was clear even without him stating it directly. Derek had never seen me as a partner, just as someone useful for maintaining his American life while he built something else entirely. My mother brought tea and sat on my other side, the 3 of us quiet in that particular way families get when words feel inadequate for the size of the betrayal. She finally said in Mandarin that I was stronger than Derek had calculated, that he'd underestimated me the same way he'd underestimated how well I understood the language he thought he was hiding behind. Catherine called Wednesday morning with news from a forensic accountant she'd brought onto my case. Thomas Wright had found evidence of systematic fund transfers from our joint accounts over the past 5 years, small amounts between $3,000 and $5,000 that happened monthly and wouldn't trigger automatic fraud alerts. The total came to over $200,000, money Derek had moved to offshore accounts before eventually funneling it into the Indonesian resort company. Thomas had also discovered that Derek maintained a separate credit card I'd never seen, the statements going to a P.O. box he'd rented under his company's name. The charges showed a pattern of international flights, luxury hotels, and jewelry purchases that definitely weren't for me. Catherine explained that this level of deception required planning and intent, which strengthened our case for both divorce proceedings and potential criminal fraud charges. She asked if I wanted to confront Derek before he left for his fake Seattle conference, and I said no, that I wanted him to go to Bali thinking everything was fine, that I wanted him to feel safe right up until the moment his world collapsed. Thursday evening, Derek packed his suitcase while I watched from our bedroom doorway, asking questions about his conference schedule and which clients he'd be meeting. He maintained the fiction perfectly, even showing me a fake itinerary he'd created with Seattle hotel letterhead and meeting times that looked official. I asked if he'd remembered to pack his good suit for the dinner presentation, and he thanked me for reminding him, adding it to the suitcase with the casual affection of someone who'd successfully deceived their spouse for years. That night, we had dinner together, and he held my hand across the table, telling me he'd miss me and would call every evening. I smiled and said I'd be thinking of him, which was true even though my thoughts weren't the kind he was imagining. After he fell asleep, I went through his office methodically, photographing documents and forwarding emails from his personal account to a secure address Catherine had set up. I found a burner phone in his desk drawer with text messages to Lily discussing their plans, including one where she asked if he'd told me yet, and he responded that he'd wait until after they were in Bali to send divorce papers, that it would be cleaner if he was already gone. Friday morning, Derek left for the airport and kissed me goodbye. His performance so convincing, I almost doubted the evidence I'd gathered. I waited until his location on Find My Friends showed he'd reached the airport before I called Catherine and told her to move forward with everything. She'd already prepared the paperwork and had a process server ready to deliver divorce documents to Derek's office within the hour, notifying his employer of the fraud investigation and freezing his access to company accounts. I drove to our bank with my father and closed our joint accounts, transferring my half to a new account Derek couldn't access. The bank manager tried to convince me to wait and think things through, but my father explained in English that his daughter had evidence of financial fraud, and the bank should be concerned about their liability in facilitating illegal transfers. That changed the manager's tone considerably, and suddenly everything processed quickly. By noon, Derek's paychecks were frozen. His company email was suspended pending investigation, and his passport was flagged for review at customs when he tried to leave the country. Catherine called me at 2 in the afternoon and said Derek had been detained at the airport, that customs had questions about the Indonesian property company, and his business visa application that listed him as relocating permanently. She explained that Derek's lawyer was already trying to arrange bail, but the federal prosecutor was reviewing charges for wire fraud and money laundering, that moving stolen funds across international borders made this a federal case rather than just a messy divorce. I asked if he'd be released, and Catherine said probably, but he'd have to surrender his passport and wear an ankle monitor, that his dream of escaping to Bali with Lily was officially dead. My hands were shaking when I hung up, because part of me had still doubted this would work, had still feared that Derek would somehow slip away, and I'd be left trying to rebuild while he lived in paradise with money he'd stolen from our marriage. My mother squeezed my shoulder and reminded me in Mandarin that truth was patient, that it waited for the right moment to reveal itself, and today was that moment. The news came through multiple channels over the next few hours. Derek's company issued a statement about an employee under investigation for financial misconduct and suspended him without pay pending the outcome. His parents called me 7 times before I finally answered, his mother demanding to know what I'd done to her son, accusing me of ruining his career over nothing. I put her on speaker and played 15 seconds of the recording where Derek discussed in Mandarin how he'd hidden money from me for years. The silence that followed was profound before his father quietly asked me to send him everything I had, that they needed to understand what their son had become. His mother started crying and apologizing, saying she'd never imagined Derek capable of this level of deception. I told them I'd cooperate with their lawyer if they wanted to try protecting him, but they should know he'd been planning to abandon his family entirely and start over in Indonesia with another woman. His father said they wouldn't be protecting him, that actions had consequences, and Derek needed to face his. Thomas Wright completed his full forensic accounting analysis by the following Tuesday, his report documenting every fraudulent transfer and hidden asset with the precision of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. The total came to over $300,000 in marital assets Derek had converted to his personal use, not including the Indonesian properties whose value had appreciated significantly. Catherine filed an emergency motion for temporary orders that would prevent Derek from accessing any remaining funds or making any financial transactions without court approval. The judge granted everything we asked for, clearly disturbed by the evidence of systematic fraud. Derek's ankle monitor meant he couldn't leave his apartment, which he'd apparently been renting separately for the past 2 years, another secret that surfaced during the investigation. The lease was in his name only with rent payments coming from one of his hidden accounts, suggesting he'd maintained this backup residence the entire time he'd been living with me. I wondered how many nights he'd told me he was working late when really he was sleeping in that apartment, living the life he'd been building toward. Lily Zhao disappeared from social media, and her LinkedIn profile went dark within 24 hours of Derek's arrest. Catherine's investigator found flight records showing she'd left Seattle for Hong Kong the same day Derek was detained, probably warned by someone that everything was unraveling. My uncle in Beijing confirmed she'd resigned from her position with Derek's company, and her Bali condo was listed for sale at a price that suggested desperation rather than investment strategy. I felt no satisfaction in her escape because the real target was Derek, the man who'd vowed to honor me and had instead spent years constructing an elaborate fraud. Catherine explained that prosecutors were building a case using the recordings I'd made plus the financial evidence Thomas had documented, that Derek would likely face federal charges in addition to the civil proceedings from our divorce. His lawyer had reached out about settlement discussions, but Catherine advised against any negotiations until we saw exactly what federal charges were filed, that Derek's legal situation would only worsen, and his bargaining position was essentially non-existent. The preliminary hearing happened 3 weeks later in a federal courtroom downtown. Derek appeared in a suit that looked expensive but wrinkled, his face showing the strain of someone whose carefully constructed life had imploded spectacularly. The prosecutor presented evidence methodically, walking the judge through each fraudulent transfer and showing how Derek had used multiple accounts to obscure the money trail. When they played portions of my recording, Derek's face went pale and he whispered urgently to his lawyer. The judge asked if Derek had been aware his wife spoke Mandarin, and the prosecutor confirmed that Derek had actively concealed his fluency specifically because he knew his wife's parents were native speakers from Beijing. The judge looked at Derek with open contempt and said this was one of the more elaborate fraud schemes he'd seen in a marriage case, that the level of premeditation was staggering. Derek's lawyer tried to argue that this was essentially a divorce dispute being criminalized, but the judge shut that down immediately, noting that international wire fraud wasn't a domestic relations issue. Bail was set at $200,000, and Derek's parents confirmed they wouldn't be posting it, that their son could sit in jail while he considered his choices. I filed for divorce formally that afternoon with Catherine presenting evidence of Derek's adultery and fraud as grounds. Oregon's equitable distribution laws meant I had strong claims to not just half of our marital assets, but potentially damages for his fraudulent conversion of jointly owned funds. Catherine was also pursuing claims against the Indonesian properties, arguing that they'd been purchased with money stolen from me and therefore I had ownership interest. Derek's lawyer sent a settlement offer within a week, proposing to give me the house and 60% of remaining assets if I agreed to drop my claims on the Indonesian properties and wouldn't testify at his criminal trial. Catherine called it insulting and countered by demanding the house, 80% of all assets including the Indonesian properties, and full cooperation with federal prosecutors. I told her I wouldn't accept anything less than complete financial accountability, that Derek had spent years stealing from me, and I wanted every dollar accounted for and returned. She smiled and said that's exactly the kind of client she preferred working with, that too many people settled for less than they deserved because they wanted the process over with quickly. The federal prosecutor assigned to Derek's case was named Amanda Reeves, and she had a reputation for aggressive pursuit of financial crimes. She met with me and Catherine to review evidence, her questions sharp and focused on establishing Derek's intent to defraud. I explained the entire timeline starting with the phone conversation I'd recorded, through the discovery of hidden accounts, to the revelation about the Indonesian resort company, Amanda asked if Derek had ever discussed his Mandarin fluency with me during our marriage, and I told her he'd actively lied about it, claiming he only knew basic business phrases when clearly he was fluent enough to conduct complex financial negotiations. She made notes and said that linguistic deception added another layer to his fraud, that it showed sophisticated planning rather than impulsive bad behavior. Amanda explained that federal sentencing guidelines for wire fraud could mean significant prison time, especially with the aggravating factors of international money laundering and duration of the scheme. She asked if I'd be willing to testify at trial, and I said absolutely, that I wanted Derek to hear in open court exactly how his deception had destroyed 8 years of my life. My parents hired their own attorney to pursue claims against Derek for alienation of affection and fraud against their daughter. Oregon didn't recognize alienation of affection claims, but their lawyer argued that Derek's fraud had targeted their family specifically by exploiting their cultural background and language. The strategy was to pressure Derek from multiple legal directions simultaneously, making settlement increasingly attractive as his legal bills mounted. My father explained in Mandarin that in Beijing when he was young, communities dealt with fraud by making the cost of deception so high that it destroyed the perpetrator's ability to function socially or economically. That wasn't exactly how American law worked, but the principle was similar: make Derek face consequences from every possible angle until he had nothing left to hide behind. My mother added that shame was powerful in Chinese culture, that what Derek had done would follow him forever, especially among business contacts who valued trust. She'd already contacted people in Derek's professional network, quietly letting them know what he'd done, and his reputation was disintegrating faster than his bank accounts. The divorce discovery process revealed more secrets buried in Derek's digital life. His laptop contained spreadsheets tracking expenses for maintaining his relationship with Lily, including an apartment he'd rented for her in Seattle and a vehicle he'd purchased in her name. The total spending on her alone exceeded $100,000 over 3 years. There were also emails discussing his exit strategy, including a message to a lawyer in Singapore about establishing residency and transferring business interests to Indonesian entities outside U.S. jurisdiction. Catherine used these to argue that Derek had been planning to abandon me permanently while leaving me financially devastated, that this wasn't just an affair, but a calculated destruction of our marriage for his personal benefit. The judge handling our divorce case granted my motion for pendente late support, ordering Derek to pay me $5,000 monthly from whatever funds he had access to until the divorce finalized. Derek's lawyer protested that his client was unemployed and facing criminal charges, but the judge noted dryly that Derek had found money to maintain a mistress and foreign properties so he could find money to support his wife. Derek's criminal trial was scheduled for 6 months after his arrest, giving prosecutors time to build their case and coordinate with international authorities. Amanda Reeves had contacted officials in Indonesia and Hong Kong, tracking the money trail through Derek's shell companies and offshore accounts. They'd frozen several accounts containing over $400,000 that Derek had been systematically hiding. Amanda explained that recovering these funds would take time because international cooperation required formal treaties and legal procedures, but she was confident most of the money would eventually be returned to me as restitution. In the meantime, Derek sat in jail, unable to make bail after his parents refused to help him. His lawyer filed multiple motions arguing that pretrial detention was excessive for a white-collar crime, but the judge maintained that Derek was a flight risk given his international property holdings and previous plans to relocate permanently to Indonesia. I visited the jail once with Catherine, wanting to see Derek's face when I told him I'd understood every word of Mandarin he'd spoken. The meeting room was gray and institutional, with plastic chairs bolted to the floor and a plexiglass divider between us. Derek appeared wearing orange jail scrubs, his hair unkempt and his face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone whose life had collapsed completely. He picked up the phone on his side, and I picked up mine, our eyes meeting through the scratched plexiglass. I spoke to him in Mandarin, my accent flawless from years of speaking with my parents, telling him I'd heard everything he'd said about me. I watched his face drain of color as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation, that the language barrier he'd counted on had never existed. I told him in Mandarin that my parents were from Beijing, that I'd spoken it since childhood, that every conversation he'd had with Lily while I was in the house had been perfectly comprehensible to me. Derek closed his eyes and his shoulders sagged forward, the physical manifestation of complete defeat. I switched to English and told him I hoped Bali had been worth it, that his dream vacation would now be spent in federal prison. Catherine touched my arm gently and we stood to leave, Derek still sitting motionless on his side of the plexiglass. The federal trial lasted 3 weeks, with Amanda Reeves presenting a devastating case built on financial records and recorded conversations. I testified on day 4, walking the jury through my discovery of Derek's Mandarin fluency and the subsequent investigation that revealed his fraud. The defense attorney tried to suggest I'd misunderstood the Mandarin conversations, that perhaps my language skills weren't as strong as I claimed. Amanda had anticipated this, and brought in a linguistics professor from Portland State, who confirmed my parents' Beijing origins, and testified that my Mandarin comprehension would be native level, given my childhood exposure. The professor also analyzed Derek's Mandarin from my recordings and confirmed his fluency was advanced, probably requiring several years of intensive study. The jury looked increasingly hostile toward Derek as the evidence mounted, particularly when Amanda played the recording where he'd laughed about me trusting him completely. Several jurors visibly reacted to his casual cruelty, the way he'd discussed his wife as someone too stupid to catch him. Lily Zhao was extradited from Hong Kong after Amanda negotiated with Chinese authorities, her cooperation purchased with a plea deal that required full testimony against Derek. She appeared in court looking smaller than her LinkedIn photos, her voice quiet as she described their 3-year relationship, and Derek's plans to divorce me only after securing all his hidden assets in Indonesian accounts I couldn't access. Lily admitted she'd known Derek was married and had actively participated in hiding money, that he'd promised her a life in Bali running luxury vacation properties once he'd successfully extracted himself from his marriage. The prosecutor asked why she'd agreed to help him commit fraud, and Lily said quietly that Derek had made it seem romantic, like they were building something together while his wife was just an obstacle to overcome. She apologized to me directly and I felt nothing, her regret meaningless against the years of deception. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, including wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud. Derek was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison with restitution ordered for the full $300,000 he'd stolen from our marriage. The judge noted that Derek had betrayed not just his wife but the trust inherent in marriage itself, that he'd constructed an elaborate criminal enterprise specifically to exploit someone who loved him. Derek's face remained blank throughout the sentencing, no emotion visible as the judge detailed how his actions had warranted significant punishment. His appeals would likely reduce the sentence somewhat, but Amanda told me afterward that he'd serve at least 6 years before parole became possible. I felt something close to satisfaction watching him led away in handcuffs, this man who'd shared my bed while planning my financial destruction. The Indonesian properties were seized as proceeds of crime and liquidated, the funds becoming part of the restitution pool. Lily received 3 years supervised probation and a $50,000 fine, her cooperation having purchased leniency, but not freedom from consequences. The divorce finalized 2 months after Derek's criminal sentencing, Catherine having negotiated a settlement that gave me everything. The house was mine, the remaining liquid assets were mine, and I received a judgment for damages that Derek would be paying off for decades. His parents contacted me through their lawyer to apologize formally and offer to contribute toward my losses, their shame over their son's actions apparently genuine. I accepted their apology but declined their money, telling them Derek's crimes were his responsibility alone. My father said later that their offer had been the right gesture from a cultural perspective, acknowledging their family's responsibility for raising someone capable of such betrayal. My mother reminded me in Mandarin that I was still young at 34, that I had time to rebuild a life based on honesty rather than lies. She was right, but the weight of 8 stolen years sat heavy in my chest. All those moments I'd believed were real now, recontextualized as elaborate performance. I sold the house 6 months after the divorce finalized, unable to live in spaces where Derek had practiced his deception. My parents helped me find a condo downtown near their favorite dim sum restaurant, the building modern and full of light. I started teaching Mandarin at a community college, my fluency finally something I could openly acknowledge rather than hide. Students asked why I'd majored in journalism instead of languages, and I told them I'd underestimated how useful Mandarin would become in my personal life, that sometimes the skills you inherit from family end up saving you. My father visited often, and we'd practice calligraphy together, his steady hand guiding mine through characters that represented concepts like truth and justice and endurance. My mother brought food in containers that lasted days, her way of ensuring I was taking care of myself while I processed everything that had happened. Derek would be eligible for parole in 6 years if he maintained good behavior. Amanda Reeves had ensured the restitution order remained enforceable for 20 years beyond his sentence, meaning he'd be paying me back until he was nearly 60. His professional reputation was destroyed, his name appearing in news articles about financial fraud and marriage deception. The Chinese business community had essentially blacklisted him. His face circulated on social media with warnings about his character. Part of me felt vindicated by his complete destruction, but mostly I felt exhausted by the amount of energy required to hate someone consistently. My therapist suggested that forgiveness wasn't about excusing Derek's actions, but about releasing the grip his betrayal had on my present life, that I deserved to move forward without carrying his weight. I wasn't ready for forgiveness, but I was tired of anger, tired of checking news articles about his appeals, tired of calculating how many years until he'd be released. I met someone new 2 years after the divorce, a man named David, who taught history at the same community college. He spoke terrible Mandarin despite having studied for a semester abroad in Taiwan. His tones all wrong, but his effort genuine. I appreciated his transparency about everything from his finances to his previous relationships, the way he offered information freely rather than making me excavate truth. We moved slowly because I needed time to rebuild trust in my own judgment, to believe I could recognize deception before it consumed years of my life. David was patient with my caution, never pushing for faster commitment or acting offended when I verified things he told me. My parents approved of him particularly after my father asked him directly in Mandarin about his intentions, and David responded in clumsy but honest Mandarin that he cared about me and wanted to build something real. My mother said later that sincerity mattered more than fluency, that David's willingness to embarrass himself speaking broken Mandarin showed more character than Derek's years of perfect deception. Derek sent a letter from prison 3 years into his sentence. The envelope arrived at my parents' house with his inmate number printed where a return address would normally be. My father called me before opening it, asking if I wanted him to read it first or if I wanted to throw it away unopened. I told him to read it and call me back with the summary. My father called 20 minutes later and said Derek had written an apology claiming he'd been lost and confused, that he'd made terrible choices and understood now how much damage he'd caused. He was apparently taking courses in prison and seeing a therapist, working toward becoming someone better than the man who'd committed fraud. My father asked if I wanted the actual letter, and I said no, that Derek's personal growth was no longer my concern. I'd moved forward and built a life where Derek existed only as a cautionary tale I sometimes shared with students about why honesty mattered more than performance. His journey toward redemption or continued failure was his alone to navigate. I thought sometimes about the moment I'd heard him speaking Mandarin that first afternoon, how a random instance of laundry folding had revealed years of lies. The fragility of deception amazed me, how one unguarded moment could unravel elaborate constructions. Derek had been fluent for probably a decade, had studied extensively and practiced with Lily, had maintained perfect operational security for 8 years, but he'd gotten comfortable and careless, speaking freely in his own home office because he believed his wife couldn't understand the language her parents had taught her since childhood. That fundamental miscalculation had cost him everything: his freedom, his career, his marriage, his reputation. I felt no pity for his losses because he'd gambled with my life as stakes and lost. The recording I'd made that afternoon had become evidence in a federal trial. My testimony about understanding Mandarin had helped send him to prison. Justice had been served through language he'd hidden behind, and that felt appropriate somehow. Poetic, even. At abandon. My parents threw a dinner party for my 38th birthday at their house with extended family and friends from the community. David helped my father hang decorations while my mother orchestrated food preparation with military precision. My uncle from Beijing called via video chat to congratulate me, his presence digital, but his warmth genuine across the distance. We ate traditional Beijing dishes my mother had spent days preparing, and my father made a toast in Mandarin about truth and family and resilience. I looked around the table at faces of people who'd supported me through Derek's betrayal and the subsequent legal battles, people who'd never questioned my strength or doubted my decisions. This was real. This was built on honesty. These relationships wouldn't dissolve when subjected to scrutiny. David squeezed my hand under the table and I squeezed back, our communication silent but understood. My mother brought out a birthday cake and everyone sang in English and Mandarin both, the two languages of my life finally existing in harmony rather than conflict. I made a wish and blew out candles, the smoke rising toward the ceiling and dissipating into air. Derek was somewhere in federal prison serving his sentence. Lily was rebuilding her life in Hong Kong under the shadow of her conviction. I was here, surrounded by people who loved me honestly, speaking both my languages without fear. That felt like victory enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.